Okay, so the next operating budget that we will prepare is the overhead budget. Okay, so this is part still of our production because along with direct materials, direct labor, overhead costs are also essential for production, although they are indirect labor or materials. Okay, so here the overhead shows the expected cost of all indirect manufacturing items. So unlike the materials and labor or direct labor and materials, there is no readily identifiable input-output relationship for the overhead items. So actually, this is the normal nature of uh, manufacturing overheads. Okay, although they are indirect or there are no identifiable input-output relationship, however, in most cases, the production process cannot do away from spending or incurring these types of costs. That's why we consider them as part of manufacturing items. So, however, overhead consists of two types of costs. So, here they also classified as the variable and fixed overheads. So, the past or based on the past experience, you can use that as a guide to determine how the overhead varies with the activity level, to determine especially for um, variable costs or variable overhead costs. So the items that vary with activity, like the supplies, utilities that is used for production or machinery and others, and the amount that is expected to be spent for each item per unit of activity is estimated. Okay, because in this case, again, just like in our previous budgets or operating budgets, although we are using the historical data as the basis for like trends and for using that to estimate the future or then in the next periods number of units or cost. So here the same also, especially with overhead case, we also make estimates. So here individual rates are totaled to obtain the variable overhead. Okay, so later as we go along with our discussion, we will have illustrations to uh, show you how to prepare this overhead budget. So here it is actually for our illustration. So we will use again for ABC company. So again, they make the concrete blocks. So each block requires 0.015 direct labor hour based on the data in the labor budget. So our variable overhead is $8 per direct labor hour. Normally, in terms of overhead, there are cases where we can um, base the rate on the underlying variable of production like direct labor or even materials. Okay, so that's why in this illustration, our basis for the variable overhead is on the direct labor hour. For the fixed overhead, so this is budgeted at $320,000 per quarter. So this is broken down into the following items. So out of $320,000, 100,000 is for the supervision, 200,000 for depreciation, and 20,000 for the rent. Okay, so to continue, the company budgeted $36,000. Labor, direct labor hours in the first quarter, 90,000 direct labor hours in the second quarter, 84,000 in third quarter, and 30,000 in the fourth quarter. So by the way, this data right here, this comes from our direct labor budget. Okay, so if you could still remember in our previous video lecture, so there we determined the direct labor hours needed for each quarter. So that's the data that we will use here for the overhead budget, especially that in this case our variable overhead is based on the direct labor. So for our requirement, number one, of course, we will construct an overhead budget for the company for their concrete block line for the coming year. So we will show the total amounts by quarter and for the total for the year as a whole. For the second requirement, what if the company's fixed overhead were 350 instead of 200, 350 per quarter instead of 350 for a year, I guess. Okay. Oh, per quarter. I mean, this is 320 per quarter. What about if the company's overhead or fixed overhead now becomes 350,000 per quarter? So how would that affect our variable overhead? How about the fixed overhead and the total overhead? Okay, so for our solution, so we have here the overhead budget. Okay, so as required in number 1. Okay, so here, again, the data are from the direct labor budget and from the given figures and amounts from the requirement. So all we have to do is just to follow whatever the number of units will be or the rate, okay, that the requirement has provided. So here, for the budgeted direct labor hours, again, these figures are from our direct labor budget. Okay, and then variable overhead rate is based on the data that is $8 per direct labor hour. So that's why we just multiply it. So the resulting figure will become our budgeted variable overhead for the quarter. And then we will add the budgeted fixed cost overhead to get the total overhead cost. Okay, so this overhead budget is simple also to prepare. Okay, so all we have to do is just to determine the basis of our variable overhead and then compute it and add the fixed overhead to get the total overhead cost. Okay, that's how simple it is, okay, to prepare the overhead budget. Okay, next for requirement number 2. Okay, so here, what about if our fixed overhead increased to 350,000? So here, does it have any effect on our overhead variable? No, because in this case, we have a separate basis for variable overhead and fixed costs are fixed based on their estimate. So therefore, any changes on the fixed overhead will not have any effect on our variable overhead. However, for the fixed overhead, of course, it will increase from 320 to 350 per quarter. So here, the total overhead will increase by 30,000 per quarter. So that's for 1 year, that's $120,000. Okay, so this is one of, preparing overhead budget is also simple, just like the first budgets that we have prepared so far. Okay, so that's for our overhead budget.